Hi, when it comes to editing interviews, there are two things you are needing to edit. One is all the ums, stutters, repeats, everything that makes the interview longer and needs to get cut out. This interview started off at 7 minutes 15 seconds. I cut all that out and now it's 5:57. But I'm not done yet. Now I need to organize the interview. The interview needs to flow in a way that makes sense to the listener. You know, it needs to be like a story or an essay. You have an introduction, you cover points in a logical order, and sometimes in interviews that does not happen. Like in this interview, just to change it up, I guess, I started off instead of by asking, "Tell me about the event," which is a good starting question, yet it's so open-ended. If you get a talkative person, they could answer all of your questions on that one question. So instead of that, I started off with, "This event has happened in the past, right?" And kind of went from that angle. It's cool and conversational, but it's better to give a broad view of the event first before you talk about how it's changed from the past. So we're going to have to do some changing in order. So let's zoom in here and see what we have.
Okay. So for this edition of Community
Okay, don't need that.
Community Focus,
Don't even need the so. Now, that for this edition of Community Focus, I don't really sound like I'm talking to anybody. I sound like I'm trying to run off the intro real quick. So that may be something I want to re-record so I can sound more warm and welcoming at the beginning of the interview. I was doing it kind of awkwardly because he was in there with me, and it's awkward to say a show intro when you're supposed to be having a conversation with somebody.
for this edition of Community Focus, I'm Camille Turner, and we have Tom Edwards, Mesquite ISD social worker, in the studio to talk about the Mesquite Back to School Fair. I remember it going on last year as well. How has this Back to School Fair developed through the years?
Okay, see, that's an awkward transition. I took out some of my stutters. It sounded more natural, but I'm going to mark that spot because I remember it happening last year as well as not a great place to start.
Last year as well. How has this Back to School Fair developed through the years?
This is a third annual event. We wanted to start something that was helpful to our families, that was good for our community, to provide resources. And so we started it 2 years ago. It went really well.
Okay, so maybe a good place to start would be, let me see if I can get a sticky note up here. Would be playing off of what he said here.
This is a third annual event.
Last year as well. How
We wanted to start something that was helpful to our
How did you get started planning this event, or what started this event up? Then he could go into how it's been 3 years.
start something that was helpful to our families, that was good for our community, to provide resources. And so we started it 2 years ago. It went really well. And now we're expanding to 3 sites this year.
So 3 sites in Mesquite. So what made you focus in Mesquite for this?
We know that there's not a ton of resources.
He says he went to 3 sites. I said, so 3 sites in Mesquite. I'm showing what I know to him, like I knew it's been going on in past years. I know it's the 3 sites in Mesquite. I even know which 3 sites. Be careful not to show off too much as the interviewer, because really you want to make sure your interviewee brings out the information. So this 3 sites in Mesquite, I'm probably going to delete. But I'm just marking all my transitions, and what I'm going to do is cut it up and reorganize it.
So 3 sites in Mesquite. So what made you focus in Mesquite for this?
We know that there's not a ton of resources and community nonprofits around Mesquite ISD. And so this was a good opportunity to connect folks with the resources that are in the community, as well as get families and kids back into the groove of things with school starting, a week or so out, making sure that they get their shots, they get their
He said a
or so out, a week or
just figure out where what you want to keep starts and delete what you don't.
things with school starting a week or so out, making sure that they get their shots, they get their school physicals, school supplies, some vision and dental checkups, trying to be as comprehensive as we can, because we know the healthier you are as a student coming in, the better you will perform in the classroom.
Okay.
So this is actually a pretty broad overview answer right here. So this may end up needing to be our first.
So 3 sites in Mesquite. So what made you focus in Mesquite?
So I don't need me summarizing 3 sites in Mesquite.
So what made you
I actually don't want the so.
what made you focus what made you focus in Mesquite for this?
We know that there's not a ton of resources, and
I asked it, what made you focus in Mesquite for this? But that's really not a great question, because it is a Mesquite ISD event, so of course they're going to put it in Mesquite. So let me change up my question to, let's see how he answers.
we know that there's not a ton of resources and community nonprofits around in Mesquite ISD. And so
What suggests there was a need for this in Mesquite? This question shows that I'm assuming it will be in Mesquite, but how is there a need that serves it?
you are as a student coming in, the better you will perform in the classroom.
Have all of these services been offered every year, or have you thought, oh, now with
Okay, so here I'm back to the years. So maybe now I'll go to that question about, I know this was in the past, can you tell me how it's developed, and reorganize. So are you seeing how first you want a broad picture of the event, and then you want to go to the specifics, but based on the conversation. Did he mention something that can naturally transition into something else? You know how to cut and paste. You could also pull it into multi-track. Let me just show you that real quick. I'm going to go to my interviews folder, because every time you make a multi-track, it's going to... And I'm going to call this Tom Edwards, because that's what I'm working on. Don't ever just call it interview, call it the topic that you're working on, because you're probably going to do more than one interview through the year. And you don't want to go, oh, well, what was interview 1? What was interview 2? You want to know, oh, that's when I interviewed this lady. It's probably better to call it by topic than by your subject name, because later I'm not going to remember who Tom Edwards was. No offense to Tom Edwards. But I would remember Mesquite Back to School event.
We're also working with Sharing Life. We're hoping, again, to have as many kids to go through there as well.
I do want to point out, when your interviewee says again, that sometimes is a hint that you've asked them something before and they're re-answering your question. So just think about that. Turns out that this guy in the interview, he just likes to say again. And some people do. And so I didn't re-ask a question. He just, I guess it makes him more comfortable to say again when he says stuff, so he doesn't feel like he's repeating himself. But knowing that, I need to take out all the agains because they don't add anything. Okay. And you see I split on the markers, which is where it needed to split. Of course, you want to be particular and make sure you didn't split off a word, but you could drag it longer or shorter on the edge in case that happened.
Expanding to 3 sites this year.
Okay.
In the classroom.
have all of these services been offered every year? What made you focus in Mesquite?
Okay, so basically, this is all I have to do. Switch the order like this. So it's either way. If you do it like this, you probably want to make a mix down and save that because that's your interview in order before you put the music on and everything else. That way you can contain that order and keep it in that order. If you do it the other way, you're going to be cutting and finding the spot where it needs to go and pasting, and so it may be a little easier to work in multi-track, but you have your choice, whatever works best. And as you can see, I'm making a list of questions. These are going to be things that I want to re-record to make them sound more natural in the interview. It's really great if you could keep your original questions, because often when you record, you sound different than when you're talking to somebody, especially somebody in an interview in the room. I sound more timid, more encouraging than I do when I'm just announcing something. even though I'm supposed to sound conversational in each case. So going back to re-record questions from the interview, keep that in mind and try to picture that person in there and talk as if that person is there. Now I have an exercise for you. It's actually from this interview. He says something and it doesn't make sense the way he says it. So you need to be able to edit the order of words within an interview so that it makes sense. And I'd like to see you do that.